very lucky tonight to have a friend and colleague of mine, Ed Brayton, who has come way from Lansing to discuss a very important issue with us tonight about the Dover trial, which we've had presentations on here before, a very important court decision that happened in December of 2005 that dealt with how evolution, creationism, intelligent design is taught in public schools. And I'll let Ed give the introduction to that. But first, a little bit of background about Ed. Ed is definitely the Renaissance man. I've known Ed for probably, I don't know, 3, 4 years now, 5 years. And we're both co-founding board members of the Michigan Citizens for Science. Beyond that, Ed is also one of the founding members of Panda's Thumb, which last year Scientific American said was one of the nation's most significant, I'm probably not getting this right, one of the most premier blog advocate sites of nature and science in the United States. So kudos to Ed and his colleagues for getting that together. And also, but Ed doesn't want to always talk about, he also was a professional comedian at one time, actually made a living on the road as a comedian, and he and I spent some time in Berkeley a couple of years ago at the National Center for Science Ed symposium, and he had me cracking up the entire time. So an amazing man. I think you're going to see that in his presentation tonight. So if you join me in welcoming Ed Brayton.
Let me ask a question first. How many people here followed the Dover Intelligent Design trial? Good. We got quite a few. The trial took place, of course, in late 2005 in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. Dover, Pennsylvania was the name of the town. And we're going to talk about the whole trial. But first, I want to start with a little bit of background, a little historical context. Because I think that trial was sort of the culmination of a very long, well, not culmination, the continuation of a very long process and a battle between science education and an anti-evolution movement, which cropped up about 30 seconds after Darwin published On the Origin of Species in 1859. His work, of course, was very controversial, particularly among the religious faithful. And to this day, the anti-evolution movement still finds most of its support in the churches. The notion that human beings had evolved and animals had evolved was quite a shock to those who believed that God had planted Adam and Eve in the middle of the Garden of Eden. And so that's where they find most of their support to this day. I don't have quite enough time for a thorough examination of the anti-evolution movement, so I'm going to give you just a brief history. 3 phases, essentially, of the anti-evolution movement. Whoops. You'll have to pardon me. This is actually the first time I've used PowerPoint. Greg was kind enough to give me a little remote control, which will work wonderful. The first phase of the anti-evolution movement was very simple. Just ban it. And that's what they tried to do. Most famously in 1922 with the Butler Act in Tennessee, which banned the teaching of evolution in public schools. That, of course, led to the Scopes trial. The ACLU was actually their first major case. They had formed in 1922. 1925 was the Scopes trial. So it was their first major sort of national splash. They recruited John Scopes and basically asked him to get arrested so that they could challenge the constitutionality of that law. Unfortunately, it didn't work. He was convicted as they hoped, but the appeals court overturned the conviction on a technicality, and they never got to challenge the constitutionality of the law. As a result, laws banning the teaching of evolution stayed on the books for another 40 years or so. And phase 1 of the anti-evolution movement continued until the late 60s. 1968 came a case called Epperson versus Arkansas, Supreme Court case, where on a 9-0 vote, the Supreme Court struck down laws banning the teaching of evolution, specifically struck down an Arkansas law. That case was brought by a science teacher by the name of Susan Epperson. That's her right there. And that was a 9-0 vote. And the reason they overturned that law, they said the Constitution requires the government to stay neutral on religious matters, but the Arkansas law was passed solely because one religious group believed that it conflicted with their beliefs. Thus, the court said the law was not religiously neutral and existed only to appease the viewpoint of a particular religious group. So 9-0, they struck down that law. This brought phase 1 to a close. Rather than going extinct, the anti-evolution movement began to evolve. And that brings us to phase 2. Which is the equal time dual model phase. Starting in the early 70s, they repackaged creationism, and they started calling it, quote, creation science, as opposed to evolution science. And that made it much more scientific sounding, put a little thin veneer of science over the top of it. And states began to pass laws requiring equal time for creation science along with evolution science. Arkansas law, again, starting in Arkansas, that seems to be where all the anti-evolution trouble starts, passed a law to require equal time, called Act 590 was the name of the case. And in 1982, there's a case called McLean versus Arkansas. Challenged the law, a group of about a dozen. Interestingly, almost all ministers. The state bishops of all the mainline Christian denominations and prominent ministers in the state of Arkansas challenged this law. And in the federal district court, they struck it down. Problem is, the state of Arkansas didn't appeal the case. And as a result, that ruling was only binding in that judicial district. And so we would have to wait until 1987. 1987 case called Edwards versus Aguilar involved a Louisiana law that essentially did the same thing, required equal time. And in the Edwards versus Aguilar case, the Supreme Court struck down that law by a 7-2 vote. Any guesses on who the two were? One of them still in the court, one of them is now dead. Scalia was one, Rehnquist was the other. So we have Scalia still on the court, who is very much pro-creationism, even back then. So they struck it down in 1987, and that, again, faced with extinction, the anti-evolution movement begins to evolve. And that brings us to phase 3. Out with creation science, in with intelligent design theory, or ID. The problem they found was that creation science was simply too specific. Because it referred to things like a 6,000-year-old Earth and a global flood, beliefs that exist in religion but not in science, it was simply too easy for judges to look at it and say, you're teaching religion. So they had to make it less specific. So they took all of what they were teaching, stripped all the testable statements out of it, essentially, and relabeled it intelligent design. The intelligent design movement is based primarily in Seattle, Washington, a group called the Center for Science and Culture, which is at the Discovery Institute in Seattle, Washington. Despite the reams of blatantly religious rhetoric with which they've tried to sell ID to their followers, they've gone to great lengths to cover their tracks. Because, again, the courts tend to look at explicitly religious statements and say, you're trying to teach religion. So, part of their strategy was get religion as far away from this theory as we could get, away from this idea as we could get. And one of the ways you can see how they did this is the evolving banner that they used on their website for the Center in Science and Culture. This was the first one, starting in 1996. They were originally called the Center for the Renewal of Science and Culture. And we'll get to a reason why they were looking to renew in a few minutes. This is the first banner they had. This was from November 1996 to April 1999. Of course, you recognize the Sistine Chapel painting of Michelangelo with God's finger touching Adam. That was a little too explicit. So the second one, they got rid of Adam, starting in 1999, and they put a double helix in there, God touching the double helix. And that was there until August of 2001. And then we get the third banner. Now, God's gone too. Now we have, this is actually a planetary nebula, which was taken by the Hubble telescope. The picture was. It looks a little bit like a human eye. So there was the third one, and that lasted until October of 2002. And then we get banner 4. And notice the name change. Renewal's gone. Now it's just the Center for Science and Culture. And that lasted until, well, let's see. I guess I don't have it in my notes. Not too long. That one wasn't there very long. And then we get the fifth one. Now it doesn't have anything in there about religion at all. Now it looks very secular, very serious, very professional. Who says creationists don't evolve? They certainly do. Despite their efforts to cover their tracks, the religious nature of the ID movement is pretty easily seen. In 1996, the CSC developed what is now called the Wedge document, which laid out their short and long-term strategy for success. This document makes plain that the ID movement is essentially a cultural jihad. Yes, that term is chosen specifically. It waged against what they call scientific materialism. And they're not just attacking evolution, they're attacking scientific materialism, which is essentially a metaphor for, or a buzzword for, atheism. Here's some of what is in the Wedge document. They promise to develop a positive scientific alternative to materialistic scientific theories, which has come to be called the theory of intelligent design. There is no theory, by the way. Design theory promises to reverse the stifling dominance of the materialist worldview and to replace it with a science consonant with Christian and theistic convictions. They also stated their goals pretty bluntly. There's two of them that they stated: to replace materialistic explanations with a theistic understanding that nature and human beings are created by God, and to see design theory permeate our religious, cultural, moral, and political life. But remember, ID has nothing to do with religion. Purely scientific theory, and if you dare to question that, you are an anti-religious bigot. That's the line that they give you. Every time you dare to quote their own words to them on the religious nature of ID, they tend to come back at you with "you're simply an anti-religious bigot." This despite the fact that many of the people who are anti-ID are religious themselves, including some that we have here this evening. The wedge document was a fundraising document. It was designed to encourage people to give money to the CSC, and so the best way to raise money is to pretend that you're standing up to the devil himself, you're on the side of God, and that tends to open up the pocketbooks of the faithful. So the document goes on and on about all of the evil things that evolution has caused. It's caused school shootings and rampant immorality and teen pregnancy, and Darwin apparently had an enormous impact that none of us have ever imagined. When they're talking to religious audiences, they're quite open about the religious nature of the ID movement. Bill Dembski, one of the top ID scholars, a mathematician, philosopher, a couple of years ago taught a series of Sunday school classes at a church in Waco, Texas. And there, he talked about what motivated him to fight evolution. And he said, as you can see here, his real opposition to evolution was that it was robbing God of his glory. In articles aimed at the faithful, he has said, for example, "Intelligent design readily embraces the sacramental nature of physical reality. Indeed, intelligent design is just the logos theology of John's gospel restated in the idiom of information theory." If that looks a lot like gibberish to you, it is. Likewise, Philip Johnson, who's the godfather of the ID movement, the one that really sort of started it all in the mid-90s, when speaking to his followers, he says things like, "If we understand our own times, we will know that we should affirm the reality of God by challenging the domination of materialism and naturalism in the world of the mind. It's all about standing up for God, making sure God gets the glory, affirming the reality of God." Unless, of course, they're speaking to the media or to academic audiences. And then their tone changes completely. All the religion talk gets put away, and they pretend that ID has nothing to do with God at all. It's a purely scientific research program. And if you quote their own words to them, you'll be accused of being a liar, an anti-religious bigot, whatever. It's quite a little deceitful game they have going, which is rather ironic given that they think that evolution causes immorality. And we will see much more of this as we get to the trial. The first thing that needs to be said about the Dover trial is that it was inevitable. It was going to happen somewhere. It didn't have to happen in Pennsylvania, but it had to happen somewhere. In fact, it very nearly happened here in Michigan. We had a case that came up around the same time that the Dover situation was coming up in Gull Lake, about an hour south of here, where two 7th grade science teachers were teaching intelligent design mixed with old-fashioned young earth creationism in 7th grade science classrooms. We get a call from a parent, daughter of a biologist happened to be in one of these classes, brought home some of the handouts, and the biologist's father wasn't pleased. So he called Michigan Citizens for Science, which Greg and I are on the board of. And we got involved, got in contact with the school board and the school administrators, and basically told them that you're headed for trouble here. You're headed for legal trouble. And they fooled around with it for a few months. Ultimately, they came to their senses and at a school board meeting decided to tell the teachers you can't teach this anymore. That case technically is still going on. We won that battle. We got it out of there. But it may still come to a suit. But had they not made that decision, we might well be here talking about the Gull Lake trial as the test. From the beginning of the intelligent design movement, everybody on both sides was waiting for a test case to get into court. And of course, we wanted the facts of the case to be as favorable to our side as we could. And the Dover case, as we'll see, was really favorable to our side. Since the late 1990s, the Discovery Institute have been going around the country trying to get school boards and state legislatures to put ID into the science classrooms under a variety of different labels. Michigan Citizens for Science and other groups have successfully fought off no fewer than 6 bills in the last few years here in Michigan that would have put intelligent design into the science classrooms under one label or another. In fact, we just stopped one last fall with the State Board of Education, where they tried to get ID added to the science standards. At the same time the Discovery Institute was doing this, another group called the Thomas More Law Center was doing the same thing. Now, the Thomas More Law Center was founded by Domino's founder, Tom Monahan, who, of course, is a Michigan boy from Ann Arbor. And that's where the Thomas More Law Center is based. Tom Monahan is a frustrated priest, an extremely conservative Catholic, who has funded a whole range of religious right activities, including this one. Thomas More folks were going around the country around the same time the Discovery Institute folks were trying to get school boards to put ID into science classrooms, but they were more specific than the DI folks. They actually had a specific book in mind, and that book was called Of Pandas and People. There we go. That is the first, the Discovery Institute calls the first intelligent design textbook ever written. Came out in 1987, and we'll get into that a little more later. They were going around the country. They went to Minnesota. They went to Virginia. School boards wouldn't bite. They sweetened the pot a little bit. Not only do we want you to teach this, we'll defend you in court for free if you do. And Dover was the first school district to bite. They wanted to get creationism into the science classrooms. Thomas More comes in with his book Of Pandas and People. They get it put in there. Now, as I said, both sides are looking for a test case. Both sides want a case that is where the facts are most favorable to our side. And as the Dover School Board began making noises about adopting an ID policy, it quickly became obvious that the facts of the case were very favorable to our side. In the final ruling, Judge Jones, in an unusually blunt statement, referred to the breathtaking inanity of the school board. Not the sort of language you typically see in a federal court ruling, but the facts were just so completely against them that it's staggering that they didn't see it. So let's meet the members of the school board that passed this. It's a 9-member board. Alan Bonsell was the chairman of the board. Bill Buckingham was the chairman of the curriculum committee. Angie Yingling, Sheila Harkins, Heather Giese, Jane Cleaver, Noel Weinrich, and Carol and Jeff Brown. And these two are very interesting. The husband and wife team that was on the school board. When that policy was passed, they were so upset they resigned from the school board and ended up being plaintiffs in this case. Ended up suing the board they had just left. The first two names on the list, Bonsell and Buckingham, I refer to them as Tweedledum and Tweedledummer of the case. They were the primary agitators. They really, really wanted creationism in science classrooms, and they pushed really, really hard to do it. The problem was they just said one stupid thing after another, and were constantly getting themselves in trouble. And this started about January 2002, just after Bonsell had been elected to the school board, started pushing to get this in. And again in 2003. And then in 2003, the science teachers began asking the board for new science textbooks. The textbooks they had were very old, worn out, some of the information was outdated, and that became the pretext for Bonsell and Buckingham to change the curriculum, now that we're getting new textbooks. The science teachers asked for a textbook, Prentice Hall biology text written by Ken Miller and Joe Levine. Ironically, Ken Miller ended up being an expert witness in this trial. And basically what the school board did was drew a line in the sand and said, we won't buy you new textbooks unless you use Of Pandas and People as a supplemental textbook and put that into the classrooms. And that didn't go over real well with the teachers. Bill Buckingham made all sorts of statements during the various talks at school board meetings about about what would happen, and you see a couple of them here. As they were debating this at one of the meetings, he said, 2,000 years ago, someone died on the cross for us, and it's time to take a stand for him. This country wasn't founded on Muslim beliefs or evolution. This country was founded on Christianity, and our students should be taught as such. Now, here's the funny part about this. These were such a problem for the ID side that he lied and said he didn't say them. They'd been reported in both the local newspapers. All of the other school board members and people who were at the school board meetings testified under oath, yes, we heard him say these things, and he said, I never said them. Now remember, like I said, you're looking for a test case here that's very favorable to our side, and the more explicitly religious statements we get, the better off we are, in terms of proving that this is just putting religion in there. Buckingham made so many gaffes like this that they tried to keep him off the stand. The defense team didn't put him on the witness list. All the other members of the school board they called didn't want Buckingham on there. So the plaintiff's team called him as a hostile witness and put him up on the stand and really grilled him. And that led to some of the more amusing parts of this trial. They had two problems. The first problem was Buckingham just wasn't very bright. Well, let's not mince words. Buckingham had the IQ of a pot roast. This man really wasn't very smart. When he got on the witness stand, after they got through the sort of obligatory state your name, occupation, etc., one of the first questions that the Steve Harvey, attorney for the plaintiffs, asked him was, do you have an understanding in very simple terms of what intelligent design stands for? What does it teach? Asking the man who wants to put intelligent design into the classroom what intelligent design is. You'd think he'd have an answer. Here's his answer. Other than what I've expressed, that scientists, a lot of scientists, don't ask me the names, I can't tell you where it came from. A lot of scientists believe that back through time, something, molecules, amoeba, whatever, evolved into the complexities of life we have now. Now that's kind of a muddled definition of evolution, but it's a lot closer to being a definition of evolution than it is to being a definition of intelligent design. So the attorney was a bit baffled. As it turned out, ignorance was not his most serious problem. The second problem that Buckingham had was that he wasn't terribly honest. Oh, let's not mince words again. He got on the stand and lied through his teeth. And I'll give you a couple of really good examples of this. One of the controversial questions was whether Buckingham had used the term creationism in advocating the new policy. Everybody said he did. The newspapers had quoted him saying he did. And he said, no, I said intelligent design. I never said creationism. Remember, we're trying to prove that intelligent design and creationism are the same thing. If you use the terms interchangeably, that looks good for our side. So they get him on the witness stand, and he was absolutely adamant that he had never, not only he had never used this term, nobody connected with this had ever said creationism. Here's a few questions from the testimony. With respect to creationism, it's your testimony that creationism was never said by any board member, including you, at any board meeting. Isn't that correct? That's true. And it's your testimony that creationism was never said to any reporters after any board meeting. That's true. And it's your testimony that you never talked about creationism, or to your knowledge, none of the board members ever talked about creationism among themselves. Yes. So after getting him about 100 different ways to, on the record, saying nobody ever talked about creationism in any context, the attorney, Steve Harvey, asked for exhibit P-145 to be pulled up. And on the screen pops a video of Buckingham speaking to a local TV reporter after one of the June 2004 meetings. The book that was presented to me, he said, was laced with Darwinism from beginning to end. It's okay to teach Darwin, but you have to balance with something else, such as creationism. Do you need to see it again, Harvey asked. No, he said. And he was a little irritated at that point. But he had a great explanation. He came up with this very fanciful explanation. He said, well, what happened was I was walking from my car to the building, and here's this lady, and here's a cameraman, and I had in my mind all the newspaper articles saying we were talking about creationism. And I had it in my mind to make sure, make double sure, nobody talks about creationism. We're talking intelligent design. I had it in my mind. But I was like a deer in the headlights of a car, and I misspoke. Pure and simple, I made a human mistake. So after spending a half an hour denying that he had ever said the word creationism under any context, he suddenly has complete recall of what was going on through his mind before he said creationism. I call this the Homer Simpson alibi. And this is from an episode of The Simpsons where Homer says, don't say you were at a bar, don't say you were at a bar. I was at a bar. Oh! So Buckingham is Homer Simpson. A second example of Buckingham's dishonesty, and this may be an even better one. One of the key questions in the case was where the money came from to buy all of the copies of Pandas and People. They had about 60 copies of it. Originally, they were going to give them to all of the students in the 9th grade science classrooms. They decided that was a little too explicit, so they ended up putting them in the library and telling them you can check it out, encouraging them to check it out. 60 copies of this book just showed up at the school one day, and nobody knew where the money came from. And so before the trial started, during the discovery phase, the attorneys for the plaintiffs were trying to find out who the heck paid for these things. And so they asked all of the witnesses, who paid for these things? Who paid for them? Nobody would say. Nobody knew, apparently. They all said they didn't know. So here's a January 2005 deposition with Buckingham and the attorney going at him, asking him, the school district received a number of copies of the book, correct? Yes. Do you know how many? 60. I haven't seen them. Do you know where that money came from? No, I don't. You have no idea? Well, I have thoughts, but I don't know. Well, what are your thoughts? I think it could have something to do with Alan Bonsell, who was the board president. Well, why do you think that? Well, he was president at the time, so I just deduced from that. Well, at the time, the attorneys genuinely didn't know who had paid for these, and really were trying to find out. As it turns out, I love this, Buckingham had gotten up in front of his church and asked them to donate money to buy these books. And they did. And then he wrote a check out of his own checking account for $850, and he gave it to Alan Bonsell. And Alan Bonsell, for some reason, gave the money to his father, who went and bought the books, and then they showed up. It's a pretty astonishing lie to tell, under oath, no less, during a deposition. Bonsell told the same lie, even though he had given the check to his father to buy the books. During his deposition, he said, I have no idea where the money came from, none whatsoever. They just pleaded ignorance the entire time. In fact, this was during the trial. One of the more entertaining moments of the trial was that when Bonsell was on the witness stand, Judge Jones actually interrupted a cross-examination and took over the questioning himself on this issue and started asking him why didn't, in fact, he said to the attorneys, give me a copy of his deposition. And they brought a copy of Bonsell's deposition up there, and the judge opened it and said, you said this. You said you didn't know. Why didn't you say you got the check from Buckingham and you gave it to your father? Well, he kind of fumbled around. I don't know if any of you ever testified in court before, but it's a pretty nerve-wracking experience. I mean, it can shake the nerves of, somebody who's pretty confident. For Bonsell in that situation, to have a federal judge, on the stand basically accuse you of perjury under oath. Okay. Not sure how to get that off there. Oh, there we go. Hold on, I can get this. Back to our regularly scheduled program. It's a sign, yeah. God doesn't want me to give this speech. But as I was saying, I suspect that Bonsell may have needed to change underwear at that point. I suspect he was a little shaken up by that. Anyway, back to the summer of 2004, the board is discussing this. They finally draw a line in the sand, and they pass this policy, and they insert the following statement into the science curriculum. Students will be made aware of the gaps/problems in Darwin's theory and of other theories of evolution, including but not limited to intelligent design. Note, origins of life is not taught. Now, I don't know if you caught this or not, but when I showed the picture of the cover of Pandas and People, the subtitle of it includes biological origins. So they insert a statement into there saying we don't talk about origins, and yet the textbook itself is subtitled Origins. They also required the teachers to read this statement before they taught the section on evolution. They were to read this statement to their students. The Pennsylvania Academic Standards require students to learn about Darwin's theory of evolution and eventually to take a standardized test of which evolution is a part. Because Darwin's theory is a theory, it is still being tested as new evidence is discovered. The theory is not a fact. Gaps in a theory exist for which there is no evidence. A theory is defined as a well-tested explanation that unifies a broad range of observations. Not a bad definition of theory, really, although they're misusing it. Intelligent design is an explanation of the origin of life that differs from Darwin's view. Remember, we don't talk about origin of life, and yet we want you to read these things. The reference book of Pandas and People is available for students to see if they would like to explore this view in an effort to gain an understanding of what intelligent design actually involves. As is true with any theory, students are encouraged to keep an open mind. School leaves the discussion of the origins of life to individual students and their families. As a standards-driven district, class instruction focuses upon preparing students to achieve proficiency on standards-based assessments. Not likely that this is actually in the science standards. As they passed this, perhaps the funniest statement of the trial came from school board member Heather Giese, who said, "Oh, we're not going to be sued. I have confidence in the district's lawyers." Problem with this was the district's lawyer had told them, "You're going to get sued and you're going to lose." Had told them, "Do not pass this." And that statement became rather prophetic. Not only did they get sued, because they had ignored their own attorney's advice, their insurance policy was canceled. So all of the money that they ended up having to pay out for the plaintiff's fees in this case, they had to pay themselves. Their liability policy wouldn't cover it. So pretty expensive mistake all the way around. Why do I keep ending up with that? Because I keep touching stuff. Let's see, now where was I? As I said, both sides here are searching for this test case, and clearly, as we go through the media reports on what was going on right here, clearly the facts are on our side in this case. Discovery Institute was pretty unhappy about it. They tried to talk the school board into withdrawing the policy because they knew if we go to court with this one and we lose, it's devastating for our whole legal strategy here. Unfortunately, the Thomas More Law Center was really gung-ho for this, and they talked the school board and said, look, we'll defend you for free. You know, don't back down. You're standing up to the devil himself, so, you know, keep going. So they did keep the policy. They ended up going to court with it, of course. On the other hand, we felt pretty confident because the facts were pretty clearly on our side. The National Center for Science Education, which is a national organization that fights to protect science education from the attacks of creationism, immediately began working with the ACLU. They recruited 11 plaintiffs total from the Dover community who would put their name on the lawsuit, including the two former school board members, Carol and Jeff Brown. And then they had to find a law firm to handle the case. Most people don't realize that the ACLU doesn't usually handle their large cases themselves with attorneys who are on staff and paid by them. What they do is they seek out large law firms who will do the case pro bono. And so in this case, Jeannie Scott, who was the director of the National Center for Science Education, sent out an email to a bunch of attorneys who had worked with them over the years, hoping that one of them might know a law firm that would handle the case. And Eric Rothschild, who was a partner with a firm called Pepper Hamilton in Philadelphia, a very large firm of about 400 attorneys, about an hour after she sent this email, he sent one back and said, we'll take it. And then he added, I've been waiting for this for 15 years. And this would prove very fortuitous. The level of commitment shown by Pepper Hamilton in this case was absolutely staggering. Normally what happens with I'm sorry, I had a picture of, there's Eric, holding up a copy of Painters and People at the first press conference. Ordinarily with cases, with firms that do pro bono work like this, they do it because it helps their public image and it gets experience for their young associates. People just out of law school, they don't have a big client list, hand them cases like this, they can cut their teeth, learn their way around a courtroom and so forth. Not this case. Pepper Hamilton assigned 3 full partners in their firm, plus 2 associates, plus several paralegals, plus receptionists, administrators, technical people. I mean, they threw the book at this thing. And it turned out very good. There was also then Richard Katsky of American United for Separation of Church and State, and Vic Walczek, who was the legal director for the ACLU of Pennsylvania. And this was really a legal dream team. What the OJ defense team was for criminal law, this was for civil law. And when this trial started, it quickly became obvious that the disparity in legal talent was really huge. The next task then was to recruit a group of expert witnesses to testify against the policy. And these are the ones they got. Ken Miller, who was the author of the textbook that they used, and a Brown University biologist. Barbara Forrest, who was a philosopher. Kevin Padian, who's a paleontologist. Brian Alters in education. Jack Haught in theology. Oops. And Robert Pennock, it says Michigan, it's actually Michigan State. Rob is the president and our co-founder of Michigan Citizens for Science, and he was an expert witness in this case as well as a philosopher of science. We'll call these the good guys. The ID side was also, show my bias, the ID side was also putting together a cast of experts. And here are the 3 primary ones. Michael Behe from Lehigh University, Scott Minnick of the University of Idaho, and Steve Fuller, who looks a little bit like Billy Bob Thornton if he was anorexic, from the University of Warwick in England. We'll call them the bad guys, if you don't mind. They had 5 other experts lined up, actually, and they all withdrew. 3 of them in June of 2005, a few months before the trial, all within 3 days of each other, all Discovery Institute fellows all withdrew from the case and offered conflicting explanations as to why. We've speculated on why we think that is, but we've gotten a whole bunch of different explanations. 2 more of their witnesses actually withdrew during the trial when they were scheduled to testify. They were supposed to be there on a Thursday. There was discussion in court. Yes, they're in town. Yes, they're at the hotel. They'll be here on Thursday morning, and they never showed up. And we have no idea. I've contacted both of them to get a comment on it. Never got a response. So we don't know why they ended up withdrawing. So now we've got the legal team. We've got the team of expert witnesses. One more group of people that were vital to the outcome of the case was the National Center for Science Education. They acted as consultants in the case. You know, attorneys aren't educated in science, most of them, and so we really had to teach the attorneys the science of evolution and the science of intelligent design so that they knew what they were talking about when they got on the witness stand. Three people from the National Center for Science Education in particular who were important in the case. On the left here, on the right side of the left picture, is Wesley Ellsbury, who is actually here. Stand up, Wes. Wes is now on leave from the NCSE and at Michigan State doing a research project, so they've loaned him to us for a while. Wes wrote a program, a text matching program, that ended up being really important to the case, and we'll get to that a little bit later. On the right here, Jeannie Scott and Nick Matsky. Jeannie Scott's the director of the National Center for Science Education. Nick Matsky was sort of the point man. He was the one that worked directly with the lawyers in the case, and he just did a tremendous job. A lot of the key moments in the case came because of his knowledge of the history of the intelligent design movement, and he was just on the ball and on top of everything. Once the whole team was put together, now the process of discovery has to begin. And that's the pretrial phase when the two sides issue subpoenas, do research, gather information, try to build their case. And this is where the case takes a real turn. Most legal cases in the real world don't look like what you see on TV. You don't get Perry Mason moments in real world trials. You don't get the witness on the stand breaking down under the relentless questioning of the attorney. You don't get the people yelling "Eureka" when they find the smoking gun. Both of those things actually happened in this case. Which is part of the reason why Paramount's looking to make a movie about it. There really is a dramatic arc to what happened. And the smoking gun moment was in July of 2005. The NCSE's archivist at the time, Jessica Moran, was searching through their material that they had there in their archives to find anything she could about the book of Pandas and People. And she came across a prospectus that was sent out by the people who owned the book, the Foundation for Thought and Ethics, or FTE, that they sent out to publishing houses to convince them to publish an early version of the book. That document referred to it as a creationist textbook, not an intelligent design textbook. They also had several fundraising letters that referred to creation, not intelligent design. She gave those documents to Nick Matsky, and that started him to thinking. If there's earlier versions of this book, they might be much more explicitly creationist, because the book was published in the fall of 1987. I remember from earlier, 1987 is when Edwards versus Aguillard came down, banning the teaching of creation science in public schools. Oh, I'm sorry, 89 was, yeah, the final version of it that we have, the final manuscript was from late 87. 89 is when the book was actually finally published. So he thought that if there were manuscripts that existed before that June 1987 ruling, they might talk about creationism a lot more, and this would help prove our case. So he brought that up to Eric Rothschild, who promptly submitted, and there's the actual email that he sent to him saying, I think we might have something here. So Rothschild subpoenas the book, and John Buell, who was the director of the Foundation for Thought and Ethics, said, I'll go to jail before I'll give them any material at all. Well, when a judge said, you either follow the subpoena or you go to jail, all of a sudden, in early 2005, a package arrives at the NCSE office, which would blow this case wide open. There were not 1 or 2 manuscripts of the book. There were 5 complete manuscripts of the book from as early as 1983. These are the versions. 1983, it was called Creation Biology. 1986, Biology and Creations. 1987, early 87, Biology and Origins. And then there were 2 manuscripts under the final name, one written in early 1987, one written in late 1987. The difference between the early 87 version and the late 87 version, there wasn't much. The content of it was pretty much the same, except the terminology suddenly has changed. Creation's gone, intelligent design is in. And in fact, here's how they defined creation in the early 1987 version. Creation means that various forms of life began abruptly through the agency of intelligent creator with their distinctive features already intact. Fish with fins and scales, birds with feathers, beaks, and wings, etc. Here's how the late 1987 version, after creationism gets banned in public schools, defines intelligent design. Intelligent design means that various forms of life began abruptly through an intelligent agency with their distinctive features already intact. Fish with fins and scales, birds with feathers, beaks, and wings, etc. Game, set, and match, folks. Here we have a smoking gun. We have absolute proof that intelligent design and creationism are exactly the same thing. We simply exchange the titles. That is a Perry Mason moment. Needless to say, we went into the case pretty confident. Wesley wrote a program, had one that he'd actually written earlier, I think, that took all of the text of these 5 versions and sort of mapped them out. And it found that in the early versions of this, creation, creationism, creation science, all those various cognates of that word appeared hundreds of times throughout the earlier manuscripts until June of '87, when the Supreme Court says you can't teach creationism. All of a sudden, gone. There's no more talk of anything to have to do with creationism, and it's all intelligent design, but the content's still the same. So the trial starts on September 26, 2005. I'm sorry, let me skip back. The ID people were pretty confident, too, because they had gotten a conservative Republican judge, Judge Jones. He had been appointed by George W. Bush. Here's what one guy had to say on Bill Dembski's webpage when that was done. Appointments on cases are done randomly. You never know who's going to get them. As soon as they found out Judge Jones, he said, Judge Jones is a good old boy brought up through the conservative ranks, a political buddy of Governor Tom Ridge, who was deep in George W. Bush's circle of power, and was appointed by GW himself. I don't know why he types that way. Senator Rick Santorum is a Pennsylvanian in the same circles. And last but far from least, George W. Bush himself drove a stake in the ground saying, teach the controversy. Unless Judge Jones wants to cut his career off at the knees, he isn't going to rule against the wishes of his political allies. Bill Dembski himself, actually, before the Dover trial came up, when this was still sort of speculative, made a little bet. I'll wager a bottle of single malt scotch, should it ever go to trial, whether ID may legitimately be taught in public school science curricula, that ID will pass all constitutional hurdles. On the 3rd day of the trial, Rob Pennock took the stand as an expert witness. Rob is a philosopher and historian of science at Michigan State, as I said, co-founder of Michigan Citizens for Science. He also, as one local reporter there in the paper said in Dover, he's a serious, serious brainiac. I think that's a compliment. We have missed no opportunity for the last year and a half to sarcastically refer to Rob as Professor Brainiac, who I hear is going to be the villain in the next Spider-Man movie. The plaintiff's case went pretty much as expected. There were no big surprises. It was very well planned out. We knew everything we needed to say, and they really didn't do much damage to our side in the cross-examination. The one testy moment came with Barbara Forrest, who was the one who was using that information. She was the one testifying on the smoking gun that we talked earlier, and they tried like hell to keep her off the witness stand. They made challenge after challenge. It went on all day in court, arguing over whether she's really an expert, whether she really is qualified. She's a philosopher. She wrote a book about the intelligent design movement called Creationism's Trojan Horse. Finally, the judge said enough. She's an expert. Put her on the stand. But other than that, it went pretty clear. It was when the defense began to present their case that things started to get interesting. As I said, the imbalance between the two teams in terms of legal talent was extraordinary, and this really started to show with how unprepared their witnesses were when they got on the witness stand. That they weren't ready for the lines of questioning that they were getting, and they really got sandbagged a lot. The first person they put up there was Michael Behe. And one of the issues that they talked about with him was peer review. One of the main criticisms of the intelligent design movement is they don't publish the way every other scientist publishes, in peer-reviewed journals, which means journals where other scientists review your work before it gets published. And they tend to publish in popular magazines, popular journals, books, for their followers that are not real technical. So they asked Behe if his 1996 book, Darwin's Black Box, had been peer-reviewed. And he said not only was it peer-reviewed, it underwent more stringent peer review than a regular book was because the subject was so controversial. The publishers really made sure that everything was in line with this, right? And he specifically mentioned a man named Dr. Michael Atchison, who was a veterinary biochemist from the University of Pennsylvania, as one of the men who had reviewed the book. And that name sort of jogged Nick Matzke's memory. He remembered having read an article in a Christian magazine that Atchison had wrote about this, talking about his peer review in the book. And here's how he describes what he did for this book. He said, we spent approximately 10 minutes on the phone. This is with the editor of the book. After hearing a description of the work, I suggested that the editor should seriously consider publishing the manuscript. It sounded like this Behe fellow might have some good ideas, although I could not be certain since I had never seen the manuscript. We hung up and I never thought about it again. But that's just the start of it. That was only half the story. The book had allegedly been reviewed by 5 people, of whom we know the identity of 4, including Atchison. The other 3 are Robert Shapiro, John Morrow, and Russell Doolittle. During and after the trial, myself and Skip Evans, who used to be with the National Center for Science Education, started doing a whole investigation. And we contacted these guys, and they gave us the reviews that they had written to the book. As it turned out, Morrow and Doolittle had slammed it and said it's absolute nonsense. Shapiro had said, I think it's nonsense, but it's probably the best written explanation of that perspective, so you probably ought to publish it. Apparently, this is what passes for stringent peer review in the world of intelligent design. Behe was also ambushed a bit on another issue. One of his standard claims in his books is that scientists have no explanation for the evolution of the immune system. And so this was a little bit of theater in the courtroom. Eric Rothschild, doing the cross-examination of him, wheels in a cart full of books about the evolution of the immune system, books and articles. And one by one, he handed them to him. Have you read this book, Professor Behe? Well, no, I haven't. Have you read this book, Professor Behe? Well, no, I haven't. And as he sat on the witness stand, they began piling up on his lap. And Behe's not a particularly tall man, and at one point he literally was having to lean around this to see Eric Rothschild. And at one point, finally, he said, excuse me, Mr. Rothschild, can you take these back? They're starting to get heavy. Which was sort of symbolic of, what he really meant to say was, the evidence is weighing me down. I'd really rather not deal with it. Rothschild's cross-examination was so effective that actually months later, Judge Jones was still talking about it in an interview. There's all the part of the books that they piled up there, by the way. In an interview later, Judge Jones said, I would say Eric Rothschild's cross-examination of Professor Behe might be as good a cross-examination of an expert witness as I've ever seen. And he said he thought it would continue to be taught in attorney advocacy classes. So pretty good all the way around. The other witness for the defense that offered really weird testimony was Steve Fuller, a sociologist, professor of science at the University of Warwick. And what made Fuller really a weird witness was he didn't believe in ID. He didn't think it was true. He said under oath, no, I don't think it's a better explanation than evolution. But here's what he did think, and this is where you get really strange. He thought that what he called radical and innovative ideas should get the benefit of a, quote, affirmative action strategy. And he actually used that phrase. How do you expect any kind of minority view with any promise to get a toehold in science, he asked. And his answer was, you basically need new recruits. And he proposed that ID should be put into public school science classrooms because it would help them recruit future scientists who might be able to develop the idea to the point where it has scientific merit. A couple of obvious reasons why this is absurd. First, history simply argues the contrary. There have been many revolutions in science where a dominant theory was replaced by a radical upstart theory, and not one of them ever needed an affirmative action strategy. Not one of them had to be put into public school science classrooms in order to help them recruit. Alfred Wegener, who came up with the continental drift theory, didn't demand that his views be put into public school science curricula in order to overcome the hidebound orthodoxy of his fellow scientists. He just got to work and kept studying, kept refining his explanations. His view was at one point the upstart new kid on the block, and now it's the old theory yelling at the kids to get off his lawn. And he didn't need an affirmative action strategy to do this. Secondly, think of the implications of this argument. He doesn't attempt to argue that ID, among all of the vast sea of fringe ideas in science, is uniquely in need of this. He said all fringe ideas in science are in need of this. So his argument logically requires that the same thing be done for the geocentrists, the flat earthers, the hollow earthers, the Raelians, the pyramidiates, the UFO cults, everybody. We're going to put all these ideas into public school science classrooms to help them recruit future scientists. To call this idea lunacy is probably to be a bit too kind. To say that the trial didn't go well for the defense is probably needless to say. On the last day of the trial, as the closing statements were wrapping up, Patrick Gillen of the Thomas More Law Center said to the judge, "It's an interesting coincidence, Judge, that the trial had taken 40 days and 40 nights. And Judge Jones responded, "That is an interesting coincidence, Mr. Gillen, but it was not by design." By the end of the trial, it was obvious that we were going to win. The question is, are we going to win little or are we going to win big? Winning little would mean a very limited ruling saying that the school board had clearly acted with a religious purpose and therefore it was unconstitutional. Winning big means a ruling on the merits of ID itself, on the nature of ID itself. That it's not a scientific theory, it's a religious idea wrapped up in scientific sounding language. And that's what we got. We won as big as we could possibly win. The day that ruling came out, at probably 7:30 in the morning, I got the first phone call, which was from Rob Pennock, who had heard from the lawyers, we won big. It'll be out shortly. And the ruling will be out shortly. And the rest of that day I was spent on the phone with people calling going, are you reading this? This could have been one of our briefs. You know, it was a spectacular decision that we won in every possible way. The reaction to the ruling has been predictable and amusing from the other side. The first thing they said was, doesn't matter. Doesn't matter. Judges don't decide science. Whatever happens in a courtroom, the future of ID depends on these hundreds of scientists, the growing number of scientists who are on our side. You know. But having said that they didn't think it mattered much, they've still spent the last 15 months throwing everything they possibly could at this ruling, every accusation. It took about 8 seconds for Judge Jones to go from being a conservative good old boy to being a radical liberal judicial activist out to destroy America. The other outcome of the case, though, is that the plaintiffs got paid. That's a check for $1. Part of the strategy of the case was they didn't want it to get mooted, which is a legal term, and so they asked for damages, $1 for each plaintiff. So the 11 plaintiffs each got $1. That's Tammy Kitzmiller's dollar hanging on the wall of her house. I think Wes took that picture, didn't she? So that's how the case ended. And that brings phase 3 of the anti-evolution movement to a close. So now the question is, will they go extinct now? And the answer is no. Phase 4 has already begun. And phase 4 is based on ideas like critical analysis of evolution. Now they say, we don't want intelligent design taught. We just want critical analysis of evolution taught. Only evolution, mind you. They don't want critical analysis of the germ theory of disease or the kinetic theory of gases. Only evolution comes in for this special treatment. The other thing that they like to say now is, we want the arguments for and against evolution taught. Those are their sort of 2 standard phrases now. Now, mind you, intelligent design theory isn't a theory at all. It's just a collection of anti-evolution arguments. So when they say, we don't want ID taught, we just want the arguments for and against evolution taught, what they mean is, we don't want ID taught, we just want ID taught. So, just a tautology. Extinction, I'm afraid, is simply too much to ask from the anti-evolution movement, and I suspect we'll be battling this for who knows how long to come. Here's the other thing that happened with Dembski, was that he had put in an expert report on there, but then pulled out just before his deposition. And so the Discovery Institute ended up filing a brief in the case. They weren't part of the defense team, but they did file a brief in the case, which included the entire expert report that Dembski had written. And the judge refused to accept it in the case because he said, you put the expert report in there, but he wouldn't testify on it, which means you're trying to get what he said into the record of the trial without being cross-examined on it. Can't do that. So, yeah, we have a lot of fun poking fun at Dembski, and have had over the years. So,
I just wonder why you think that phase 3 is over and phase 4 is beginning, because I keep still seeing things. American United for separation of church and state keep publishing things about we're defending against intelligent design. They just did something in Howell School District was trying to get intelligent design in. Right. So I guess I wonder why you think phase 4 is beginning and phase 3 is over.
When I say that one phase is ending, another one beginning, that just means they're putting a new label on it, is all it means. The activity is the same. It's, to use the biblical metaphor, they keep pouring old wine into new skins. And all they do is change the labels. And so we're just into a new rhetorical phase is all we are. The ideas aren't going to go away. So. Yeah.
To add to your phase 4, want to know what your comment is on the avoidance. I teach in public schools, and we just avoid it altogether,
oh, yeah.
especially beyond biology.
Yep.
don't counter any arguments?
There was a survey done of a national science teaching organization, and Greg may know about this, with his involvement with science teachers, but there was a survey done not too long ago that showed that a staggering percentage of high school biology teachers don't even talk about evolution, that they're just, it causes so much controversy. They get phone calls, you know, you're teaching atheism, you're going to send my child to hell, you know, blah, blah, blah. And so a lot of teachers just avoid it. And so they don't talk about evolution at all. They might talk a little bit about change over time, you know. But mostly they avoid it. And even where the ones that don't avoid it, and we were talking about this at dinner earlier, we spend so little time in most public school science classrooms in biology, even in AP biology, talking about evolution. I mean, it gets maybe a week in an entire semester that they get of real discussion of the theory of evolution and the lines of evidence that support it. So we have a real problem with the way we teach evolution in this country in science classes. We don't teach it nearly enough. We don't teach it nearly well enough. We don't spend enough time on it. And part of the problem is that those of us who are active in this fight to protect it is we're so busy putting out fires because the anti-evolution movement is so aggressive and so well funded that, you know, we just spend all of our time trying to keep them, you know, the gates closed to keep them on the outside. There are some things going on. And Greg Forbes, who I know, you know, works with your group, has a great project. He's part of the Evolution Education Initiative. He's the head of that. And what they do is teach science teachers how to teach science, how to teach evolution. And that's a hugely valuable program that I wish would be replicated nationwide, and if I wish there was grant money available for it, because we can't spend all of our time on the negative stuff, you know, fighting the battles. At some point, we've got to get down to the serious task of improving science education and making sure that people understand it better. A phenomenon. I have a friend in England who is a Baptist minister who's just baffled. He just can't believe that anybody would question evolution. It's a Baptist minister, you know, and he just can't believe in England that you know, there would be any question about this, even in Protestant churches, you know. It is starting to go international. We're starting to see a lot. England just started up a big pro-intelligent design group there, and so they're getting more aggressive in other countries too. There's not a lot we can do about that, but yeah, it is definitely moving international, and other countries are going to have to start dealing with the same thing. I don't think it'll ever have in most other countries, I don't think it will ever have the kind of strong support that it does.